Non-controlling interest. Non-controlling interest, also known as minority interest, is an ownership stake of less than 50% in a corporation. The position held gives the investor zero or only a small amount of influence on how the company is run. Non-controlling interests are measured at the net asset value of the entities that are owned by the investor. When calculating the value of non-controlling interests, voting rights are not considered. Finally, non-controlling interest is also used when talking about subsidiary companies. When talking about subsidiary companies, non-controlling interest would refer to the equity interest of the subsidiary that is held by outsider investors instead of the parent company. To determine if an investor's position is a non-controlling interest, the ownership stake must be insignificant compared to the total number of outstanding shares. This means that any stakeholder that owns less than 50% of outstanding shares of a company has a non-controlling interest in that company. The majority of publicly traded companies have such a large number of shares outstanding that a normal investing position cannot influence the company's activities. However, since they have such a large number of shares outstanding, having even 5 to 10% of total outstanding shares can represent a huge amount of voting power in the company. Nonetheless, an investor is considered as having a non-controlling interest as long as they own less than a majority of the shares in a company, even if they have a large amount of voting power. There are two types of non-controlling interest. The first type is direct non-controlling interest. Direct non-controlling interest means that the investor receives a proportionate share of all equity recorded by the subsidiary. This includes both pre-acquisition and post-acquisition amounts. The second type is indirect non-controlling interest. In indirect non-controlling interest, the investor only receives a proportionate share of a subsidiary's post-acquisition equity. This is because an indirect ownership stake is formed when an investor has financial ownership in a company that has ownership in another company. Another way to phrase this is that the investor has a non-controlling interest in subsidiary A, and subsidiary A has a non-controlling interest in subsidiary B. When calculating non-controlling interest, we use the consolidated equity instead of recorded equity to calculate the non-controlling interest portion. We need to make adjustments to eliminate any unrealized gains or losses from transactions within the group of companies when calculating direct and indirect non-controlling interest. Companies should also be providing transparency about non-controlling interest to make sure investors have a better view of how non-controlling interest affects the group's financial position, cash flows, and risks. Investors will then be better informed about the actual value of assets and liabilities attributable to the holders of non-controlling interest. We hope you found this introduction to non-controlling interest helpful.